Welcome to Mrigashira, a podcast that communicates with communicators. This podcast is a tribute to our fantastic fellow professionals, colleagues, and friends. I'm Charu Raizada, and this podcast is brought to you in association with Digitales. It's been widely accepted that if a company invests in its employees, the productivity levels are far higher. COVID has brought to the fore the value of internal communications and the need for a fresh approach. Today on Mrigashira, we have with us Ray Walsh, a communications and internal localization consultant and the author of Localizing, Employee Communications, a handbook. Ray talks to us on the importance of employees' first approach and creating a team of local co-creators with the right skills, tools, and processes to take global employee communications to a new level. Stay with us on Mrigashira. Hi Ray, welcome to Mrigashira.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You've been working with international companies to close the communication gap between headquarters and global workforces. So with COVID setting the alert for an employee's first approach, tell us what has changed.
Well, I have to go back a little bit. I have been in Europe since 2007. I'm American. I've been in corporate communications for longer than that. And even though I support the headquarters team very often, what I often see from this, let's say the regional perspective, is a sort of disconnect. Corporate still thinks of itself as the center of all information, and it does a lot of broadcast and cascading. They'll tell us, go ahead and adapt this, go ahead and translate this, but they don't give us the time. They don't give us the resources, and sometimes we don't have the skills to do this. So I started researching, and I wrote a book. It's out almost 2 years now, to try to wake them up to that. The fact that their campaigns are not working as well, because they are very headquarters centric. And when it's coming from headquarters, regardless of where that is, whether it's in Germany, as I've seen, or the US or the UK, those are the kind of companies I've worked with. It also comes with a lot of cultural assumptions. Even though they have the best of intentions and they expect us to adapt, they just don't really understand why that's breaking down.
You're right. I mean, culture sometimes can really make or break a certain campaign. Something which has worked in other markets may not work because of the cultural barriers. And what would be your suggestions to break those cultural barriers and really have more engagement between employees, especially when it comes to cross-border communication and working with different people?
Well, the book that I wrote was very, very much aimed at my corporate colleagues at the headquarters, to wake them up to the kind of realities that are happening locally. Although there are a lot of things that we can do locally, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But as far as, I think the times are changing very quickly. I think the tools we use are much more global. Our organizations are becoming much more global, even within just the last 5 years, I would say. And I think that our tools and our organizations in many ways will be ready for this before we are as corporate communicators. And I think we need to speed this up, and we need to adapt because I think it's coming. And if you look at enterprise social or social media, people very much have that expectation of being, a full-on participant in this dialogue. And one interesting thing in the last year, I've seen much more talk, at least in the localization world, of personalization. Now, I believe they're talking more about the kinds of things you do with your information, the metadata you use, and so that it can be really adapted to the user. But I really think that this is where the experience is going. And yet, our corporate headquarters are still in this very much hierarchical, top-down, cascading, here comes the campaign, get ready to adapt it.
I've seen that, and more so now, because I think somewhere there is this whole belief that, if it's more centralized, while you follow all the messaging, but you are able to keep the costs in check, which isn't really the case most times, because if the campaign doesn't really work out or doesn't get you the desired results, you really haven't saved much. You've really been, penny wise and pound foolish, as they say.
I'm sorry, that's a very good point, because when you really look at the numbers, at least with the numbers that I've seen for consumption globally, there's a huge drop off. There's the home country, it's hard enough to get attention, but outside of the home country, it's in some places it's almost zero. So in that case, you've really wasted all of your money on this campaign. You really haven't got much out of it at all.
Now, you talked about social media, and what's always intrigued me is some of the brands which have like a very good footprint in number of markets, they still tend to centralize social media, especially LinkedIn and Twitter.
Is that a good approach? Is that a wise approach?
My experience in social media is limited. However, from what I've witnessed of the clients that I've had, they do some local social media teams, and they do have some autonomy. And what's interesting about that is very often those social media teams have more autonomy than, say we in the internal communications team have. That's sort of interesting. But what I've also seen is that they don't really have the resources. They're very much a small team, a small island, and they may be responsible for, say, France, and they handle that Twitter handle or that LinkedIn account. But I don't think they're getting the support they need. And I think, what does support look like? It's not so much that, here's the post, translate it, but more, I think they need a bigger view of what the calendar looks like. What are we trying to say this quarter? What are we trying to say this year? And then also give them, visual assets, not just, here are the photos you use, which can, for example, look very much like they're from the home country, but also, graphics and infographics and so on. But this is very important. They need to be adaptable. So if you give somebody an InDesign file and they don't have InDesign, well, you haven't really shared much with them. So I think they need more time. They need a big view of the calendar. They need more resources, maybe access to a creative team or creative tools. And then I think it's worth talking about very regularly, what are the key messages for this this time period, this short term and medium term. What are we trying to get out there? And then I think it's up to the teams to take all that together and put it together and make it really speak to the audience that they're going for.
So with mass departures happening, what economists have termed as the Great Resignation, 5 things you feel employers need to do to make the employee feel heard. Because most often we see that the employee feels that he or she is not being heard. So how do you bring in that change in mindsets and get the employers, or 5 things you feel employers need to do to make the employee really feel that he's valued and he's heard?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that in the last year we've talked a lot about diversity and inclusion in a corporate setting, and I think that's a huge step forward. And I think it's really great that we're talking about this. And yet, I think we're still running organizations that are very traditional and hierarchical in terms. So the first one is simply ask and listen. And I know we say that all the time, but I mean, really do it and really ask what are the communication needs. Number 2 is to trust. I mean, you've got these communications people in these local markets. As long as you have the conversation, as long as they're briefed on everything that you're trying to accomplish together, then you've got to trust them to actually execute. And then 3, give them what they need. I think more often than not, the number one thing they need is time. Very, very often we get these campaigns together and it's like, okay, here's all the assets for the campaign that starts Thursday. It doesn't give them enough time to translate. It doesn't, if they need to do any visual adaptation, if they need to subtitle anything, they simply just don't have enough time. So number 3 would be just to give them, far more notice and any kind of support that they need to actually execute. And then I guess for the 4th point, I do have a lot of advice for the headquarters office, but I think I would like to shift it a little bit to the regions. Because of the corporate behavior that we've seen so often, I find sometimes a bit of passivity from us in the regions. We just sort of shrug and say, oh, well, that's the way corporate does it. We get sort of beaten down and tired of bringing this up, but I think we really need to be our own champions and our own advocates. So if we need more time, demand it. If we need more resources, demand it. And maybe it makes us feel like a nag. Maybe we don't really like that position. But the fact is that the priorities at the headquarters office are always changing. There's always personnel changes. And maybe all of a sudden, even though you've been saying this for 6 years in a row and nobody said anything, maybe all of a sudden they're going to realize, we should actually start listening to you. And we need to speak up more. And even if we're not quite comfortable in that, I think we need to make the headquarters office aware of what we're trying to do and what we can do. And then as a 5th, I guess it's just, from both sides, the regular check-in. I know we have, many organizations have that weekly call. They sort of update each other and each other's activities, but I think it would be good to have at least quarterly, maybe semi-annually, some kind of virtual conference about what we're trying to achieve and what our goals are for this year. We get so distracted in the day-to-day and the short term and the execution. We need to get this out this week. But I think we need to step back and think big picture and think collaboratively about what that big picture looks like.
Your book, Localizing Employee Communications, a handbook, stresses on the need for localizing and creating the final corporate content. Tell us more on this. Tell us some of your experiences working with different companies where localizing really helped them in a big way to meet their business objectives.
So the word localizing often invokes language and culture, and I think that that's important. And even if you can accomplish just that, so I had a client where we ran an intranet that was geographically focused, and we just translated content in just our core markets, which was about 5 languages within Europe. And then the rest of Europe, we didn't have the resources, and it was just continued as we did before in English. And we did see a huge increase in the engagement with content, but huge increase. If I state it as a percentage, it sounds impressive, but if I stated in raw numbers, we went from 0 to maybe a couple of hundred clicks for these things. In a large company, that's really not very much. And I think a lot of companies see that too with their enterprise social. They see a small community of people engaging with content, but not really, they're not getting huge numbers. So I think the language helps, but I think the biggest thing that needs to happen is local relevance. And for example, I've worked with more colleagues in India in the last 3 years than I have my entire career put together. And here in Prague, a lot of the bigger employers are running here like shared service or centers of excellence, call centers, that sort of activity. So within any of those locations, you might have 15 or 20 languages. So it may be impractical in those settings to translate to all of the languages. Although interestingly enough, I do think the tools may get us there very quickly. But I think local relevance is really what we're going for. It may include adaptation for language and culture, but it may not. And I think the only people that can add that local relevance are local people, perhaps local management. So then the question becomes, well, how do we make communications more of a community activity, where we're all responsible for communicating? And I think that's really what I'm trying to put forward and encourage people. So, and I think the things that have worked the best are those things which I've already mentioned. You need the calendar so that people can see what's coming. And I realize that it's all penciled in. I realize that it's not set in stone, but at least an idea of what the calendar might look like. I think key messages are completely reasonable, and I don't know why so many companies keep these close to the PR group and are so afraid of sharing it. I don't know what could possibly go wrong if they share it with professional communicators. Calendar, key messages, creative resources. That's really important at a time of very highly visual communication. Not all of us are good with visual design. So if we have some creative resources either within our region or at the headquarters office that we can engage with, that would be that's huge. And then give people time to make the adaptations, to make it really good. Instead of the problem with translations, which is a very good step, but the thing is that even if it's in another language, it still speaks the language of the corporate office. It still speaks in very large global generalities that aren't very specific and relevant.
So when it comes to startups or SMEs, when it's very difficult for them to attract the right talent, how can they build their brand, especially online, to attract the right kind of people which are going to help them meet their business objectives?
What's interesting to me about startups is that even though they have the most advanced idea, they're thinking very forward into the future, there's still a kind of traditional mindset about how we put our organizations together. And very often communications for a startup is the CEO speaks to the people. So it's a video or something. This is a very traditional approach. So I think that even from the very beginning, they've got the opportunity to really lay down this cultural framework from the very beginning of that we are a company of dialogue. We are a company of a community of people, and all ideas are shared here openly. And I think their communication should reflect that. So I think they should really be going out of their way to think beyond the CEO video and think about what dialogue looks like for their organization, and then try to represent that in their external facing materials as much as they can. So it's not so much the CEO not that the CEO is wrong, because they're probably a very charismatic, visionary person, but there should also be other voices included so that people get much more of a sense of what is it really like to work there.
I'm going to end with just last question, and you've answered pretty much most of it, but if you could just summarize for us in just clear 2-3 points that, how does one define a clear set of procedures for a very robust employee communication program?
If a company is going to really seriously consider localization or even any kind of adaptation, collaboration at a local level, I think it's probably best to start it out in, not to do it globally all at once, but to really pinpoint your key markets, find where those resources are, the people that are going to help you do this, and collaborate with them. So it may be your largest markets, it may be your most strategic markets, it may be some combination of that, but these are the countries where you have people in place who have a stake in communications and perhaps have some skills. So I would say start with developing your core team, your core virtual global network that's going to help you do this. And then the second thing that I think is very important from the beginning is set some benchmarks so that as you have some successes, you can actually demonstrate it and then maybe use those numbers to expand the program. What's interesting in the localization world, from what my research tells me, is that once a company starts localization, they tend to expand. So let's say they start out with 10 languages, and over time it becomes 15, and then it becomes 20. And I think if we start this with internal communications, I think we'll find the same thing. I think we will find return on investment in taking this up, and I think it will expand.
Thank you so much, Ray. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hope you enjoy listening to Mrigashira, a podcast for communication folks. Do share your suggestions and feedback on Mrigashira at digitales.co.in. Have a great week ahead, and do not forget to tune in next week. Adios.